The rain came down in sheets, a relentless gray curtain that blurred the edges of the world. It pounded against the windshield of the old pickup truck as it rattled down a forgotten road somewhere in the backwoods of Maine. Inside, Abigail Carter gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, her breath shallow. The wipers squeaked uselessly, smearing mud and water across the glass, and the radio spat static, its signal long lost in the storm. She was alone, or at least she thought she was. The call had come 3 days ago. Her brother, Daniel, hadn't been heard from in weeks. He'd moved out to this godforsaken stretch of nowhere to find himself, renting a cabin near a town so small it barely registered on maps. His last text had been cryptic, "Found something strange down here. Don't tell anyone yet." Then nothing. Abigail had tried calling, texting, even emailing, but the silence grew louder with each passing day. So here she was, driving through a tempest, chasing a gut feeling that something was terribly wrong. The truck jolted as the road turned to gravel, then to mud. Trees loomed on either side, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. The air smelled of wet earth and something sharper, something metallic she couldn't place. Abigail squinted through the downpour, her headlights catching a faded wooden sign, Wicker Hollow, 2 miles. The name sounded wrong, like a whisper you'd hear in a nightmare and forget by morning. She didn't see the figure until it was too late. It darted across the road, a blur of pale limbs and tattered cloth, gone before she could scream. The truck swerved, tires skidding in the muck, and Abigail slammed on the brakes. The engine sputtered and died. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she stared into the dark, the rain drumming a frantic rhythm on the roof. "What the hell was that?" she muttered, her voice trembling in the empty cab. She fumbled for her phone, the screen glowing faintly in the gloom. No signal. Of course. She cursed under her breath and reached for the flashlight in the glove compartment. The beam cut through the rain, illuminating twisted trees and puddles that rippled like black mirrors. Nothing moved. No sound but the storm. She told herself it was a deer, maybe a lost hiker. But the shape she'd seen, it wasn't right. Too thin, too fast. Abigail took a deep breath, steeling herself. She couldn't stay here. Daniel's cabin was close. She could feel it. She grabbed her backpack, stuffed to the first aid kit, a knife and half-empty water bottle, and stepped out into the deluge. The cold hit her like a slap, soaking through her jacket in seconds. She swung the flashlight around, its beam trembling with her hand. The road stretched ahead, swallowed by shadows. She started walking, mud sucking at her boots, the wind howling through the trees. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the underbrush, made her jump. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, its gaze prickling the back of her neck. After what felt like hours, the cabin emerged from the dark, a squat, weathered thing with a sagging roof and windows like empty eyes. The door hung ajar, swaying faintly in the wind. Abigail's stomach twisted. "Daniel?" she called, her voice swallowed by the storm. No answer. She stepped onto the porch, boards creaking underfoot. The air here was different, thicker, heavier, laced with that same metallic tang. She pushed the door open wider, the hinges groaning in protest. The flashlight swept across the room. Overturned chair, a shattered mug, papers strewn across the floor. And blood? The smeared trail of it, dark and glistening, leading to the back of the cabin. Abigail froze, her breath catching in her throat. "Daniel!" she shouted again, louder this time. The silence pressed back, suffocating. She followed the trail, each step a battle against the scream clawing up her chest. It led to a trapdoor in the floor, half hidden under a rug. The latch was smeared with more blood, still wet. Her hand shook as she lifted it. The hole yawned black and endless, a stale, damp breeze rising from below. Something clattered deep within, a sound like bones knocking together. Abigail's mouth went dry. She didn't want to go down there. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to get back in the truck and drive until the storm was a memory. But Daniel was her brother. She couldn't leave him. She found a rope coil by the fireplace and tied it to a beam, testing its strength. With the flashlight clenched between her teeth, she lowered herself into the dark. The air grew colder, the walls narrowing around her. The rope swayed as she descended, the beam of light bouncing off rough stone. She couldn't tell how deep it went, 10 feet, 20 more, but the sounds grew louder. A rhythmic tapping, like fingernails on wood, and then a whisper. Abby. She nearly lost her grip. The voice was faint, distorted, but it was Daniel's. Dan, she called, her voice echoing off the walls. The tapping stopped. Silence flooded in, thick and oppressive. Her boots hit solid ground, and she swung the flashlight around. She was in a tunnel, its walls carved with strange, spiraling symbols that seemed to pulse in the light. The air stank of rot and copper. Ahead, the tunnel curved into shadow. The blood trail continued, thinner now, but unmistakable. Abigail forced herself forward, her footsteps muffled by the damp earth. The whispers started again, soft, overlapping, a chorus of voices she couldn't understand. They clawed at her mind, tugging at memories she didn't want to face. Her father's funeral, the fights with Daniel, the night she'd left home and never looked back. And then she saw it. A figure crouched at the tunnel's end, its back to her. It was human-shaped, but wrong, limbs too long, head tilted at an impossible angle. It didn't move, didn't breathe. Abigail's light flickered, the beam stuttering across its pale, glistening skin. She took a step closer, her knife trembling in her hand. Daniel, she whispered. The figure's head snapped around. Its face was a hollow mask. No eyes, no mouth, just smooth, featureless flesh stretched tight over bone. A scream tore from Abigail's throat as it lunged, impossibly fast, its claws slashing through the air. She stumbled back, the flashlight clattering to the ground, plunging her into darkness. The last thing she heard was her own name, whispered from everywhere and nowhere at once. Darkness swallowed Abigail whole. The flashlight lay somewhere in the dirt, its beams snuffed out, leaving her blind and gasping. The air was thick with the stench of decay, pressing against her lungs like a living thing. She scrambled backward, her hands clawing at the damp earth, the knife still clenched in her fist. The thing, the hollow-faced nightmare, hadn't made a sound since it lunged. No footsteps, no breath, nothing. Just silence, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the frantic thud of her own heart. Her back hit the tunnel wall, cold stone biting through her soaked jacket. She held her breath, straining to hear anything over the blood roaring in her ears. The whispers had stopped, but the memory of them lingered, slithering through her mind like worms. Abby, it had sounded like Daniel, but twisted, like a recording played backward. She didn't know what was worse, the thought that it was him, or that it wasn't. She fumbled in her pocket for her phone, the screen's weak glow flaring to life. No signal still, but the light was enough to see the tunnel stretching ahead, its walls glistening with moisture, or something worse. The blood trail was gone, smeared into the dirt by her own retreat. The figure was nowhere in sight. Abigail's chest tightened. It hadn't left. She could feel it, a presence lurking just beyond the light's reach, watching her. Get it together, she hissed to herself, her voice a shaky thread in the dark. She couldn't stay here. Up was the only way out, the rope still dangled somewhere above, her lifeline to the cabin. She forced herself to her feet, legs trembling, and edged along the wall, keeping the phone's light low. Every step felt like a gamble, the tunnel floor uneven beneath her boots. She didn't dare look back. The rope came into view, swaying faintly in the stale air. Abigail grabbed it, her palms slick with sweat and mud, and started to climb. The tunnel seemed to tighten around her, the walls pressing in as if alive. Her arms burned, the rope chafing her skin, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. The whispers started again, soft at first, then louder, a cacophony of voices overlapping in a language she didn't know. They clawed at her skull, pulling at her thoughts, her fears. Halfway up, something grabbed her ankle. It was cold, impossibly strong, and yanked her downward with a force that stole her breath. She screamed, kicking wildly, her phone slipping from her hand. It hit the ground below with a crack, the light winking out. Darkness flooded in again, and the thing pulled harder. Abigail clung to the rope, her nails digging into the fibers, but it was like fighting a tide. Her legs dangled in the void, and she felt it, claws brushing her skin, sharp and deliberate. "Let go!" she shrieked, twisting to swing her knife. The blade met something solid, something that gave with a sickening squelch. A low, guttural sound echoed up from below. Not a scream, not a growl, but something in between. The grip loosened just enough for her to haul herself upward, adrenaline surging through her veins. She didn't stop until her hands found the edge of the trapdoor, and with a final, desperate heave, she pulled herself onto the cabin floor. She kicked the trapdoor shut, the thud reverberating through the empty room. Her chest heaved as she scrambled to her feet, dragging a heavy chair over to pin it closed. The whispers were gone, replaced by the howl of the storm outside. Rain lashed the windows, the wind rattling the panes like it wanted in. Abigail backed away, her knife still raised, her eyes locked on the trapdoor. It didn't move. Nothing did. For a moment, she thought she'd escaped. Then she heard it, a faint scratching, slow and deliberate, coming from beneath the floor. It wasn't frantic, wasn't rushed. It was patient. Abigail's blood ran cold. Whatever was down there wasn't done with her. She stumbled to the cabin's front door, her boots slipping on the blood-smeared planks. She had to get out, get to the truck, get anywhere but here. But as she reached for the handle, the scratching stopped. Silence fell again, sharp and unnatural. She froze, her hand hovering over the knob. The air shifted, growing heavier, colder. A shadow moved behind her, too tall, too thin, reflected in the cracked glass of a nearby window. She didn't turn around. She couldn't. Her breath hitched as she flung the door open and ran into the storm, the rain stinging her face like needles. The truck was still there, a dark shape in the mud, its headlights dim and flickering. She threw herself inside, slamming the door shut and fumbling for the keys. The engine sputtered, coughed, then roared to life. She didn't look back as she floored it, the tires spinning before catching traction. The road blurred past, trees whipping by in the storm's fury. Abigail's hands shook on the wheel, her mind racing. She didn't know what she'd seen, what she'd fought, but it wasn't human. And it had known her name. The thought gnawed at her, a splinter in her sanity. She had to find Daniel, had to know if he was still alive, or if he'd become something else. The truck jolted as the road dipped, and the headlights caught something ahead. Abigail slammed on the brakes, the vehicle skidding to a stop. A figure stood in the middle of the path, motionless, its head bowed. The rain plastered its ragged clothes to its frame, but it didn't shiver, didn't flinch. Slowly, it raised its head, and Abigail's scream died in her throat. It had no face, just that smooth, hollow mask glistening wet in the light. But this time, it wasn't alone. Shadows shifted behind it, more figures stepping into view, their movements jerky and wrong. They didn't speak, didn't rush. They just stood there, watching her as the storm raged on. The truck's engine stuttered, then died. The headlights flickered once and went out, plunging her into blackness. Abigail's hands tightened on the wheel, her breath fogging the windshield. The figures didn't move closer, but she could feel their presence growing, pressing against the glass, the metal, her mind. And then, from the passenger seat, came a whisper. "Abby, why did you leave me?" She whipped around, her knife slashing at empty air. Nothing was there, just the seat, the backpack, the rain drumming on the roof. But the voice lingered, soft and accusing, sinking into her bones. It was Daniel's. She was sure of it. The scratching started again, this time from beneath the truck. The scratching beneath the truck was slow, methodical, like a blade carving through wood. Abigail's breath caught in her chest, her eyes darting to the floor as if she could see through the rusted metal. The sound wasn't loud, not over the storm's relentless roar, but it was close, intimate, as if whatever was down there wanted her to know it was there. Her hands fumbled with the keys, twisting them in the ignition. The engine whined, sputtered, but refused to turn over. Come on, she hissed, slamming her palm against the steering wheel. Outside, the faceless figures hadn't moved. They stood in the rain, their hollow heads tilted slightly, as if listening. The headlights were dead, but the faint glow of the dashboard cast jagged shadows across their forms. There were 5 of them now, or 6. The darkness blurred their edges, making it impossible to count. Abigail's skin prickled. She didn't know what they were waiting for, but the stillness was worse than an attack. It was deliberate, patient, predatory. The scratching stopped. Silence flooded in, sharp and suffocating. Abigail held her breath, her knife trembling in her lap. The whisper came again, softer this time, from somewhere behind her. "Abby, it's cold down here." She whipped around, her heart lurching into her throat. The back seat was empty, the windows fogged with her panicked breathing. But the voice, it was Daniel's, unmistakably his, laced with a despair she'd never heard before. "Stop it," she whispered, pressing her hands to her ears. "You're not real. You're not him." But the words felt hollow, even to her. She didn't know what was real anymore. Not after the tunnel, not after the thing with no face. Her mind spun, grasping for an anchor, something solid. All she could hear was the rain, the wind, her own ragged breathing. The truck shook as a gust slammed against it, the storm's fury a distant roar compared to the chaos in her head. She tried the ignition again. Nothing. The battery was drained, or something worse had gotten to it. Her eyes flicked to the figures outside. They hadn't moved, but their presence seemed to grow heavier, a weight pressing against the truck's frame. The air inside was thick, damp, the smell of wet earth, and that sharp metallic tang seeping through the cracks. Abigail's chest tightened. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't wait for them to come closer. She grabbed her backpack, shoving the knife into her belt, and yanked the door handle. The wind tore it from her grip, slamming it open with a bang that made her flinch. Rain lashed her face, cold and biting, as she stumbled out into the mud. Her boots sank deep, the ground sucking at her with every step. She didn't look back, she couldn't. She ran, the storm swallowing her gasps, the trees looming like sentinels in the dark. The road stretched endless ahead, a slick ribbon of muck and shadow. Her lungs burned, her legs aching, but she pushed forward, driven by the primal need to escape. The figures were behind her. She could feel them, their eyeless gazes boring into her back. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to move, had to find help, had to find Daniel. The whispers started again, faint at first, carried on the wind. "Abby, don't leave me." They twisted through the rain, threading into her thoughts like smoke. She clenched her jaw, forcing them out. It wasn't him. It couldn't be. But the doubt gnawed at her, sharp and relentless. What if it was? What if he was down there, trapped, waiting for her? Her foot caught on something, a root, a rock, and she went down hard, mud splashing across her face. Pain shot through her knee, but she scrambled up, wiping the grime from her eyes. The flashlight was gone, lost in the tunnel, and her phone was a shattered wreck. She had nothing but the knife and her own fraying courage. The wind shifted, carrying a new sound, a low, keening wail, rising and falling like a wounded animal. It wasn't the storm. It wasn't human. Abigail froze, her breath hitching. The sound came from ahead, somewhere in the trees, and it was getting louder. Closer. She swung around, searching the darkness, but the rain blurred everything into a gray haze. Then she saw it, a flicker of movement, darting between the trunks. Too fast, too pale. Another figure, like the ones behind her, but this one was different. It moved with purpose, its limbs jerking in unnatural angles, as if its bones were broken and rest-rown. It didn't stop, didn't hesitate. It was coming for her. Abigail bolted, veering off the road into the forest. Branches clawed at her arms, her face, tearing at her jacket. The ground sloped downward, uneven and treacherous, but she didn't slow. The wail grew sharper, splitting the air, and she felt it in her bones, a sound that wasn't just heard but felt, a vibration that rattled her teeth. She tripped again, tumbling into a shallow ditch. Mud coated her hands, her knees cold and slick. She pressed herself against the bank, her chest heaving, trying to quiet her breathing. The wail stopped abruptly, leaving only the rain's steady drum. She peered over the edge, her eyes straining through the downpour. The figure stood at the top of the ditch, motionless. Its head tilted, featureless and smooth, rain streaming down its pale skin. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but Abigail knew it saw her. Not with eyes, it didn't have any, but with something else, something that reached inside her and squeezed. Her stomach churned, bile rising in her throat. Then it turned, sharp and sudden, and darted back into the trees. Abigail blinked, her mind racing. Why had it stopped? Why hadn't it come for her? She didn't have time to think. Another sound cut through the storm. Crack, like wood splitting, followed by a low, guttural growl. It came from behind her, from the direction of the road. She scrambled out of the ditch, her hands slipping in the mud, and ran deeper into the forest. The trees thickened, their branches tangling overhead, blocking out what little light remained. The growl came again, closer now, and with it, the sound of something heavy crashing through the underbrush. Not the figures, something bigger, something worse. Abigail's foot sank into a puddle, water soaking through her boot, but she didn't stop. The air grew colder, the metallic smell stronger, stinging her nose. She burst into a clearing, a jagged circle of dead grass and twisted stumps, the ground scarred with deep, claw-like gouges. In the center stood a stone slab, weathered and cracked, its surface stained dark. Blood, she realized, her stomach lurching. Old blood, baked into the rock. The growl erupted behind her, deafening, and she spun around. It emerged from the trees, a mass of shadow and sinew, taller than a man, its body a grotesque tangle of limbs and teeth. It didn't have a face either, but its head split open, revealing a maw lined with jagged, glistening fangs. The air vibrated with its rage, its hunger, and Abigail knew she couldn't outrun it. She raised the knife, her hand shaking, her back to the slab. The creature lunged, faster than anything that size should be, its claws slashing through the rain. She ducked, the blade glancing off its hide, and rolled to the side. Pain flared in her shoulder as its claws grazed her, tearing through fabric and skin. Warmth spread down her arm, her own blood mixing with the mud. The creature turned, its maw snapping inches from her face. She swung again, driving a knife into its side. It roared, a sound that shook the ground, and reared back. Abigail didn't wait. She ran, stumbling toward the trees, her vision blurring with rain and tears. Behind her, the creature's roar faded, replaced by a new sound, footsteps, light and uneven, circling the clearing. The faceless figures were back, closing in from all sides. And from the slab came a whisper, soft and pleading. "Abby, help me." She stopped, her heart shattering. It was Daniel's voice, clearer now, raw with pain. She turned, torn between the slab and the shadows tightening around her, the knife slick with blood in her hand. Abigail stood frozen, rain streaming down her face, her blood-soaked shoulder throbbing in time with her pulse. The whispers from the stone slab clawed at her, each syllable a needle in her skull. "Abby, help me." Daniel's voice, unmistakable now, trembled with a desperation that cut deeper than the creature's claws. The faceless figures circled the clearing, their pale forms flickering in and out of the storm's gray haze. They didn't advance, didn't lunge, just watched, their hollow heads tilted in unison. Behind her, the creature's growl rumbled low, a predator biding its time. She clutched the knife tighter, its handle slick with mud and blood. Her eyes darted between the slab and the shadows, her mind screaming at her to run, to fight, to do something. But that voice, Daniel's voice, rooted her to the spot. She couldn't leave him again. Not like she had years ago, when their father's death had fractured their family, when she'd walked away from his anger and her guilt. She'd abandoned him once. She wouldn't do it now. "Daniel," she called, her voice cracking against the wind. The whispers stopped, the air thickening with silence. The slab loomed ahead, its surface glistening wet, the dark stains shifting in the dim light like veins pulsing beneath skin. She took a step toward it, then another, her boots sinking into the sodden earth. The figures didn't move, but their presence pressed harder, a weight that made her chest ache. The creature growled again, closer now, its massive form lurking at the clearing's edge. Abigail didn't look back, she couldn't. Her focus narrowed to the slab, to the voice that had called her here. She reached it, her trembling hand hovering over the stone. It was cold, unnaturally so, the chill seeping into her fingertips before she even touched it. The symbols carved into its surface, spirals and jagged lines, seemed to writhe, glowing faintly in the dark. "Daniel, where are you?" she whispered, pressing her palm to the stone. The cold bit deeper, racing up her arm, and the whispers erupted again, not just Daniel's voice now, but dozens, hundreds, a chorus of agony and rage. "Help us, free us, don't leave us." The sound burrowed into her skull, her vision swimming as the clearing tilted around her. She yanked her hand back, gasping, but the voices didn't stop. They were inside her now, clawing at her thoughts, her memories. She stumbled, her knees buckling, and caught herself against the slab. The rain blurred her sight, but she saw it, a crack in the stone, thin and jagged, splitting its center. Something glistened within, dark and wet, like blood welling from a wound. She leaned closer, her breath fogging in the icy air, and the crack widened, just enough for her to glimpse what lay beneath. Dozens of them, staring up at her, human eyes, wide and terrified, suspended in a void of black. They blinked, darted, pleaded, and Abigail's scream lodged in her throat. She recoiled, falling back into the mud, her hands scrabbling for the knife she dropped. The eyes didn't follow her, they couldn't, but she felt them, their gaze searing into her soul. The creature roared, shattering the trance. It charged from the trees, its maw gaping, claws slashing through the rain. Abigail rolled to her side, snatching the knife as the beast's talons sank into the earth where she'd been. She scrambled to her feet, her shoulders screaming in pain, and swung the blade. It caught the creature's flank, drawing a spray of dark, viscous fluid that hissed as it hit the ground. The beast reared back, its head splitting wider, teeth gleaming like shards of glass. She didn't wait for it to recover. She ran toward the slab, driven by a frantic, irrational need to reach it, to find Daniel. The figures moved then, closing in from the edges, their jerky steps silent against the storm. They didn't attack, just herded her, their hollow faces turned toward her like mirrors reflecting nothing. She reached the stone, slamming her hands against it, the cold burning her skin. "Daniel!" she screamed, pounding the slab. "Where are you?" The crack widened further, the eyes within shifting, and a hand shot out, pale, blood-streaked, nails torn to the quick. It grabbed her wrist, its grip iron-tight, and Abigail's heart stopped. The fingers were familiar, lung-thin, the scar across the knuckles from when Daniel had punched a wall during one of their fights. "Abby," the voice came from the crack now, raw and guttural, barely human. The hand pulled, dragging her closer, and she saw him, or what was left of him. Daniel's face pressed against the stone from below, his skin gray and stretched, his eyes wild with terror. His mouth moved, but the words were drowned by the chorus of whispers erupting around them. "Free us, free us." The creature lunged again, its claws raking the air inches from her back. Abigail twisted, slashing at a hand, Daniel's hand, her knife slicing through flesh. It released her with a howl, not just from him, but from the slab itself, a sound that shook the ground. She stumbled back, staring as the crack snapped shut, sealing Daniel away. The eyes vanished, the whispers fading to a low hum. The figures closed in tighter, their circle shrinking. The creature circled too, its growls vibrating through the mud. Abigail stood trapped between them, her knife raised, blood dripping from her shoulder and her blade. She didn't know what the slab was, what it held, but it wasn't just Daniel down there. It was something older, something vast, and it wanted out. A new sound cut through the storm, a sharp metallic clank, like chains snapping. It came from beneath her feet, from the earth itself. The ground trembled, fissures spiderwebbing out from the slab. The figures froze, their heads snapping downward, and the creature let out a shriek that pierced her eardrums. Abigail's knees buckled as the shaking intensified, the mud bubbling like boiling tar. Something was waking up. The slab split open with a deafening crack, and a wave of cold, rancid air blasted upward, knocking her flat. She hit the ground hard, her vision blurring, the knife slipping from her grasp. Shadows poured from the crack, not smoke, not mist, but something alive, writhing, coiling into the air. They twisted into shapes, faces, hands, torsos, before dissolving back into the dark. The whispers became screams, a cacophony of torment that drowned out the storm. Abigail crawled backward, her hands sinking into the mud, her eyes locked on the slab. The figures didn't move, didn't react, they just stood there as if waiting. The creature, though, shrank back, its massive form cowering before the shadows. And from the crack came a single, clear voice, Daniel's, unbroken by the chaos. Abby Ron. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed the knife and bolted, tearing through the clearing as the shadows surged higher, swallowing the slab, the figures, the creature. The forest blurred past, branches snapping against her arms, her legs burning with every step. The screams followed her, a tide of sound that threatened to pull her under, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. The road came into view, the truck a distant shape in the rain. She reached it, yanking the door open and throwing herself inside. The keys were still in the ignition. She twisted them, praying, and the engine coughed to life. She slammed her foot in the gas, the tires spinning before catching, and the truck lurched forward. Behind her, the forest pulsed with darkness, the shadows spilling beyond the trees. The figures stood at the road's edge, their hollow faces turned toward her, unmoving. The creature was gone, consumed or fled, she didn't know. But the screams, they lingered, echoing in her skull, Daniel's voice fading into the chorus. She drove, the storm raging around her, the road stretching into oblivion. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to keep moving. The slab, the shadows, Daniel, they weren't done with her. She could feel it, a pull in her chest, a whisper in her blood. The truck's mirror reflected nothing but rain and dark. Until it didn't. A figure sat in the back seat, pale and still, its hollow face staring back at her. The truck hurtled down the rain-slicked road, its engine groaning under the strain, but Abigail barely heard it. Her eyes were locked on the rearview mirror, where the faceless figure sat, its hollow head tilted slightly as if studying her. The cab was silent. No whispers, no scratching, just the steady drum of rain and the rasp of her own shallow breathing. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but its presence filled the space, a cold, suffocating weight that pressed against her lungs. She gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles white, her shoulder throbbing where the creature's claws had torn through her flesh. Blood soaked her sleeve, warm and sticky, but she didn't dare look away from the mirror. The figure's smooth, featureless face glistened faintly in the dashboard's dim glow, raindrops clinging to its pale skin like tears. It wasn't Daniel, she knew that now, but it wore his shape, his broad shoulders, the way he slouched when he was tired. A cruel mimicry. "Get out," she whispered, her voice trembling. The figure didn't react. It just sat there, still as death, its head cocked at that unnerving angle. Abigail's stomach churned. She couldn't fight it, not here, not now. She needed to focus, to drive, to put as much distance as possible between her and the forest, the slab, the shadows that had swallowed everything. The road twisted ahead, a narrow scar through the trees, the storm blurring its edges. The headlights flickered, weak and unsteady, casting jagged pools of light that danced with the rain. She pressed harder on the gas, the truck shuddering as it picked up speed. The figure remained a silent passenger, its presence gnawing at her sanity. She couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for something, for her to brake, to stop, to turn around. The whispers started again, faint and distant, threading through the storm's roar. "Abby, come back." They weren't coming from the figure. They were outside, carried on the wind, seeping through the truck's cracked windows. She clenched her jaw, forcing them out, but they grew louder, sharper, overlapping into a chorus of pleas and accusations. "You left us. You left me. Don't run." "Shut up," she screamed, slamming her fist against the dashboard. The voices stopped, but the silence that followed was worse, thick, expectant, like the calm before a blade falls. The figure shifted then, just slightly, its head straightening. Abigail's breath hitched. She glanced at the mirror again, and for a moment, she thought she saw something. A flicker of eyes where there should have been none, dark and hollow, staring into her. The truck swerved as her hands jerked, tires skidding on the wet gravel. She yanked the wheel, correcting course, her heart pounding against her ribs. "Stay focused," she muttered, her voice a lifeline in the chaos. She couldn't lose control, not now, not with that thing behind her. She didn't know what it wanted, but she wasn't going to find out. The road dipped suddenly, plunging into a shallow valley. The trees thinned, their skeletal branches giving way to open ground, a stretch of barren fields, churned mud, and jagged rocks. In the distance, a faint light glimmered, winking through the rain. A house? A gas station. Hope flared in her chest, fragile but fierce. If she could reach it, find people, she might survive this night. She pushed the truck harder, the engine rattling in protest. The light grew brighter, resolving into a single bulb swinging from a pole, its glow illuminating a squat, weathered building. A diner, she realized, its neon sign flickering, Wicker Hollow Eatery, open 24/7. The name sent a chill down her spine, but she didn't care. It was shelter, it was safety, it was a chance. She pulled into the gravel lot, the truck skidding to a stop. The figure was still there, unmoving, its hollow face fixed on her in the mirror. Abigail grabbed her backpack and knife, her hand shaking as she fumbled with the door. She didn't look back as she bolted out, the rain soaking her anew, and ran for the diner's entrance. The bell above the door jangled as she burst inside, the sound sharp and jarring in the quiet. The diner was empty, or nearly so. A single waitress stood behind the counter, wiping it down with a rag. Back to Abigail. The air smelled of burnt coffee and grease, a stark contrast to the forest's rot. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow over the cracked linoleum and vinyl booths. Abigail's boots squeaked on the floor as she stumbled forward, her chest heaving. "Help me," she gasped, her voice raw. "Please, something's after me." The waitress turned, and Abigail's words died in her throat. The woman's face was smooth, featureless, a perfect blank slate. She tilted her head, just like the figure in the truck, and set the rag down with deliberate slowness. Abigail staggered back, her knife slipping from her hand and clattering to the floor. No. The waitress didn't move closer. She just stood there silent. As the diner's lights flickered, a low hum rose from the walls, a vibration that Abigail felt in her bones. She turned to run, but the door was gone, replaced by a solid wall, the bell dangling uselessly above it. Panic clawed at her chest as she spun around, searching for an exit. The windows showed nothing but blackness. No rain, no storm, just an endless void pressing against the glass. Footsteps echoed behind her, slow, uneven, wet. She whirled, and there it was, the figure from the truck, standing in the doorway to the kitchen. Water dripped from its tattered clothes, pooling on the floor, its hollow face gleaming under the lights. It took a step forward, then another, its movements jerky and wrong, like a puppet on broken strings. Abigail backed against the counter, her hands scrabbling for anything, a weapon, a way out. Her fingers closed around a fork, its tines bent and dull, but it was something. The figure stopped a few feet away, its head tilting again, and the waitress mirrored it, their movements synchronized. The hum grew louder, a sound that wasn't sound but pressure, squeezing her skull. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered, tears mixing with the rain on her face. "What do you want?" The figure raised a hand, its long, thin fingers trembling slightly. It pointed, not at her, but past her, toward the counter. Abigail's eyes followed, and she saw it. A trapdoor, set into the floor behind the counter, its edges smeared with dark stains. The waitress stepped aside, her hollow face still turned toward Abigail, as if inviting her to look. The hum became a pulse, a heartbeat that shook the diner. The trapdoor rattled, something beneath it straining to get out. Abigail's stomach lurched. She knew that sound, that feeling, the same cold, rancid air she'd felt at the slab. Whatever was down there, it was connected to the forest, to Daniel, to the shadows that had chased her here. The figure took another step, its hands still outstretched, and the waitress moved too, closing in from the side. Abigail's grip tightened on the fork, her mind racing. She couldn't fight them both, not like this, not trapped. But the trapdoor, it was a way out, or a way deeper into whatever nightmare this was. She didn't know which was worse. A scream erupted from beneath the trapdoor, not Daniel's, not human, but something ancient, furious, and alive. The floor buckled, cracks splintering outward, and the lights flickered violently. The figure lunged, faster than before, its claws slashing toward her. Abigail dove over the counter, landing hard on the other side, her shoulders screaming in pain. She scrambled to her feet, the fork still in her hand, and faced the trapdoor. It burst open, a blast of frigid air and shadow exploding upward. The figure and the waitress froze, their heads snapping toward it, and Abigail saw her chance. She didn't think, she ran, leaping over the gaping hole, her boots slamming onto the floor beyond. The kitchen door loomed ahead, and she threw herself through it, the diner's hum chasing her into the dark. Behind her, the scream grew louder, the shadows surging, and the figure's hollow face turned to follow her, its hand still pointing. The kitchen door slammed shut behind Abigail, the sound swallowed by the din of the diner's pulsing hum. She stumbled forward, her boots slipping on the greasy tile, the air thick with the stench of rancid oil and something sharper, something alive, metallic, like blood left to fester. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed and flickered, casting erratic shadows that danced across the walls. Her shoulder throbbed, her breath came in ragged gasps, and the bent fork in her hand felt laughably small against the nightmare closing in. She didn't stop to look back. She couldn't. The scream from the trapdoor still echoed in her ears, a primal, guttural thing that shook her bones. Whatever had burst free was coming. She could feel it, a pressure building in the air, a hunger that gnawed at the edges of her mind. The figure and the waitress were behind her, their hollow faces burned into her memory, but it was the shadows that scared her most. They weren't just darkness, they were alive, and they wanted her. The kitchen stretched before her, a claustrophobic maze of stainless steel counters, rusted sinks, and shelves cluttered with dented pots. Knives hung from a rack above, their blades glinting dully in the stuttering light. Abigail lunged for one, dropping the fork with a clatter and wrapping her fingers around a chef's knife, long, heavy, its edge chipped but sharp enough. It felt real, solid, a lifeline in her trembling hands. A low creak sounded behind her, the door shifting on its hinges. She spun, knife raised, her heart lurching into her throat. The door was still closed, but something scraped against it, slow and deliberate, like claws testing the wood. The hum intensified, vibrating through the floor, and the lights flickered faster, plunging the room into brief bursts of darkness. In one of those flashes, she saw it, a shadow spilling under the door, thick and liquid, pooling on a tile like oil. "Stay back," she shouted, her voice cracking. The shadow paused, quivering, then surged forward, splitting into tendrils that slithered across the floor. Abigail backed away, her boots squeaking, her eyes darting for an exit. A swinging door loomed at the far end of the kitchen, its small window smeared with grime. She bolted for it, the shadow tendrils snapping at her heels, their edges curling like fingers. She hit the door shoulder first, pain flaring through her wound, and stumbled into a narrow hallway. The air here was colder, damp, the walls streaked with mold and peeling paint. A single bulb swung overhead, its light weak and yellow, swaying with every pulse of the hum. The hallway stretched in both directions, left toward a faint murmur of voices, right into shadow and silence. She didn't have time to think. The shadow tendrils burst through the kitchen door behind her, a writhing mass that swallowed the light. She ran left, toward the voices, her knife clutched tight. The hallway twisted, the walls narrowing, the air growing heavier with every step. The murmur sharpened into words, low, overlapping, a chorus of whispers she couldn't place. She's here, she's close, don't let her go. They weren't human, not entirely, their tones sliding between pleading and menace. Abigail's stomach twisted. She didn't know what she was running toward, but she couldn't go back. The hallway opened into a storage room, its shelves lined with cans and jars, their labels faded and illegible. A rusty freezer hummed in the corner, its door ajar, frost spilling out in thin wisps. 3 figures stood in the center, not the hollow-faced ones, but people, or what might have once been people. Their backs were to her, their heads bowed, hands clasped as if in prayer. They wore tattered diner uniforms, aprons stained with grease and something darker, hair matted with grime. "Hey," Abigail called, her voice hoarse. "Help me, please." The figures didn't move, didn't turn. The whispers grew louder, spilling from their mouths, though their lips remained still. "She's ours, she's marked. Bring her back." The air pulsed, the hum sinking into her skull, and Abigail realized too late that they weren't allies. One of them turned, a man, his face gaunt, eyes sunken and black, like pits carved into his skull. His mouth stretched into a grin, too wide, teeth jagged and yellow. "You shouldn't have come," he rasped, his voice layered with the whispers, a sound that made her skin crawl. The others turned too, a woman with stringy hair and a boy no older than 16, their faces mirrors of the man's, hollow and raw. Abigail raised the knife, backing toward the freezer. "Stay away from me," she warned, her voice trembling but firm. The man took a step forward, his grin widening, and the woman giggled, a high broken sound that echoed off the walls. The boy tilted his head, his black eyes glinting, and lunged. She swung the knife, the blade slicing through his arm. He didn't scream, didn't bleed, just staggered back, his grin unfaltering as dark fluid oozed from the wound. The woman darted in next, her nails clawing at Abigail's face. Abigail ducked, driving the knife upward, catching her in the side. The woman shrieked, a sound that split the air, and fell, writhing on the floor. The man charged, his hands outstretched, fingers curling like talons. Abigail stumbled into the freezer, the cold biting her skin, and yanked the door shut behind her. It slammed with a heavy thud, the latch clicking into place. She pressed her back against it, her breath fogging in the frigid air as the man pounded on the other side. The blows shook the frame, the metal groaning, but it held for now. The freezer was small, its walls slick with ice, shelves lined with frozen meat wrapped in plastic. The hum was quieter here, muffled, but the whispers lingered, seeping through the cracks. "You can't hide. We see you." Abigail's chest heaved, her shoulders screaming as she clutched the knife. She scanned the space, her eyes landing on a grate in the floor, a ventilation shaft, rusted and narrow, but big enough to crawl through. The pounding stopped. Silence fell, sharp and unnatural. Abigail held her breath, straining to hear anything. Footsteps, whispers, the shadow tendrils. Nothing. Then a soft tap like a finger against glass. She turned, and her blood ran cold. The freezer door has a small window, fogged with frost, and pressed against it was a face, hollow, smooth, featureless. The figure from the truck stared in at her, its head tilted, rain still dripping from its pale skin. She didn't scream, she couldn't. Her throat closed, her body locked in place. The figure didn't move, didn't blink, just watched as the whispers swelled again. "Abby, come back." The voice was Daniel's, soft and pleading, tugging at her heart. She shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. "You're not him," she whispered, forcing the words out. "You're not." The grate clattered behind her, a sharp metallic clang that made her jump. She spun, knife raised, as the sound came again, something moving in the shaft, scraping against the metal. The air grew colder, the frost thickening on the walls, and a low growl rumbled up from below. Not the creature from the forest. This was different, smaller, but no less menacing. The freezer door rattled, the figure's claws scraping against it, and the grate shook harder. Abigail was trapped, the walls closing in, the cold sinking into her bones. She dropped to her knees, prying at the grate with the knife, her fingers numb and clumsy. It gave with a screech, revealing a dark, narrow tunnel dropping into shadow. The growl grew louder, closer, a wet snarl echoing up from the depths. She didn't have a choice. She slid into the shaft, the metal biting her skin, and pulled the grate back into place just as the freezer door buckled. The figure's claws tore through, and the growl erupted into a howl as something lunged from the tunnel below. Abigail crawled, her elbows scraping, the darkness swallowing her whole, the knife clenched between her teeth. Above, the figure's hollow face pressed against the grate, watching her go. Below, the thing in the shaft snapped at her heels, its breath hot and rancid. And through it all, Daniel's voice whispered, soft and relentless, "Abby, don't leave me again." The ventilation shaft was a coffin of rust and shadow, its walls pressing against Abigail's shoulders as she dragged herself forward. The metal groaned under her weight, sharp edges snagging her jacket, tearing at her wounded shoulder. The knife clenched between her teeth tasted of blood and steel, its blade scraping her lips with every ragged breath. Behind her, the thing in the tunnel snarled, a wet guttural sound that vibrated through the shaft, too close, too alive. She couldn't see it, but she felt its hunger, its heat, a stark contrast to the icy air biting her skin. Her elbows bled as she crawled, the rough surface shredding her sleeves, but she didn't stop. The shaft sloped downward, steep and slick, the darkness absolute. Above, the grate clattered faintly, the hollow-faced figure still watching, its claws scraping the metal in a slow, deliberate rhythm. The whispers followed her, Daniel's voice weaving through the chaos. "Abby, I'm here. Don't leave." They tugged at her guilt, her fear, but she gritted her teeth against them, forcing herself onward. The growl surged closer, and something brushed her boot, claws, slick and sharp, grazing the sole. She kicked back, her heel connecting with something soft and yielding. A yelp echoed through the shaft, sharp and furious, and the thing recoiled, but only for a moment. Its snarl returned, louder, angrier, the sound of teeth snapping inches from her legs. Abigail's heart hammered, her pulse the deafening roar in her ears. She crawled faster, her hands slipping on the damp metal, her shoulders screaming with every movement. The shaft twisted sharply, a jagged turn that slammed her against the wall. Pain flared through her ribs, stealing her breath, but she pushed through, the knife nearly slipping from her mouth. The tunnel leveled out, widening just enough for her to move her arms freely. Ahead, a faint glow flickered, dim orange, like a dying ember. An exit, maybe. Hope sparked in her chest, fragile and desperate. The thing lunged again, its claws raking her calf. Fire shot up her leg, warm blood soaking her jeans, and she screamed, the sound muffled by the knife. She twisted, swinging her arm back, the blade slashing blindly. It hit something, flesh, bone she couldn't tell, and the creature howled, a sound that shook the shaft. She didn't wait to see if it was dead. She scrambled toward the light, her hands clawing at the metal, her body a mess of pain and adrenaline. The glow grew brighter, resolving into a grate at the shaft's end, its bars rusted and bent. Beyond it, a room flickered into view. Stone walls, a dirt floor, a single lantern swinging from a chain. Abigail reached it, slamming her palms against the grate, her fingers curling around the bars. It gave slightly, creaking under her weight, but held fast. She spat the knife into her hand, wedging it between the bars, trying with all her strength. The metal groaned, bending, and the growl behind her swelled into a roar. The grate popped free, clattering to the floor below, and Abigail tumbled after it, landing hard on the packed earth. Pain exploded through her body, her shoulder, her leg, her ribs, but she rolled to her feet, knife raised, her eyes darting around the room. It was small, circular, the walls carved with the same spiraling symbols she'd seen in the tunnel beneath the cabin. The lantern swayed, casting wild shadows that twisted the symbols into faces, screaming, eyeless faces that seemed to watch her. The shaft above rattled, the creature's claws scraping closer, its snarl a promise of violence. Abigail limped to the center of the room, her breath fogging in the cold, her gaze sweeping for an exit. There was none. No doors, no windows, just the shaft she'd come from and a stone pedestal in the corner, its surface stained dark. The air pulsed with that familiar hum, low and insistent, sinking into her bones. The creature's head emerged from the shaft, a mass of matted fur and jagged teeth, its eyes glowing a sickly yellow. It wasn't like the forest beast. This was smaller, leaner, its body a grotesque fusion of animal and something worse. It dropped to the floor with a wet thud, its claws digging into the dirt, its gaze locked on her. Abigail backed toward the pedestal, her knife trembling in her hand, blood dripping from her leg onto the ground. It lunged, faster than she could react, its jaws snapping at her throat. She ducked, the knife slashing upward, catching it across the muzzle. Dark fluid sprayed, hissing as it hit the stone, and the creature reared back, shrieking. Abigail swung again, driving the blade into its side, but it twisted, its claws raking her arm. She stumbled, the knife slipping from her grip, and fell against the pedestal. The creature pounced, pinning her to the stone, its weight crushing her chest. Its breath was hot, rancid, its teeth inches from her face. She clawed at it, her nails digging into its flesh, but it didn't flinch. Panic surged, her vision blurring, and then the pedestal shifted beneath her. A click echoed through the room, sharp and mechanical, and the floor dropped away. She fell, the creature tumbling with her, a scream tearing from her throat. Darkness swallowed them, the lantern's light snuffed out, the hum rising to a deafening roar. She hit water, cold, black and deep, its icy grip pulling her under. The creature thrashed beside her, its claws slashing blindly, but the current was stronger, dragging them apart. Abigail kicked, her lungs burning, her wounded leg heavy and useless. She broke the surface, gasping, the water churning around her. She was in a cavern, vast and echoing, the ceiling lost in shadow. Bioluminescent fungi clung to the walls, casting a faint, sickly green glow over the underground river. The creature surfaced a few feet away, its yellow eyes blazing, but it didn't swim toward her. It couldn't. The current held it, pulling it downstream, its snarls fading into the dark. Abigail clung to a jagged rock, her body trembling, the cold sinking into her core. The water stank of rot and copper, the same metallic tang that had haunted her since the cabin. She scanned the cavern, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The river stretched ahead, disappearing into a tunnel, but along the shore, a narrow ledge led to a stone archway, its frame carved with more symbols. The whispers returned, soft and insistent, rising from the water itself. "Abby, you're close, so close." Daniel's voice again, laced with pain, pulling at her heart. She shook her head, tears mixing with the river on her face. "I'm trying," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm trying to find you." She dragged herself onto the ledge, her soaked clothes weighing her down, her wounds screaming with every move. The knife was gone, lost in the fall, but she pressed on, limping toward the archway. The hum pulsed stronger here, the symbols glowing faintly, their light throbbing like a heartbeat. Beyond the arch, a staircase descended into shadow, its steps slick with moss and blood. Something moved behind her, a ripple in the water, too deliberate to be the current. She turned, her breath catching, and saw it, a figure rising from the river, pale and featureless, its hollow face turned toward her. It didn't swim, didn't wade. It simply stood, the water parting around it, its head tilting in that familiar, unnerving way. The whispers swelled, Daniel's voice cutting through them. "Abby, it's me. Help me." The figure raised a hand, beckoning, its fingers trembling slightly. Abigail's chest tightened, doubt and fear warring within her. Was it him? Could it be? She took a step back toward the stairs, her eyes locked on the figure. The water rippled again, and another figure emerged beside it, then another, their hollow faces mirroring the first. They stood in silence, watching her, the river swirling around them. The whispers became a scream, a cacophony of voices, Daniel's, hers, strangers, tearing at her mind. She turned and ran down the stairs, the shadows closing in, the figure's presence a weight on her back. The steps spiraled deeper, the air growing colder, the hum a living thing that pulsed through the stone. At the bottom, a chamber loomed, a vast, domed space, its floor a mosaic of bones, its walls alive with writhing symbols. And in the center, chained to a slab, was Daniel, or what was left of him. The staircase ended abruptly, spilling Abigail into the chamber like a breath expelled from the earth. Her boots crunched on the floor, a mosaic of bones, human and otherwise, fused into the stone with uncanny precision. Skulls stared up at her, their empty sockets glinting with faint green light from the fungi clinging to the walls. The air was thick, humid, laced with the stench of decay and that ever-present metallic tang. The hum pulsed here, a heartbeat that shook the bones beneath her feet, resonating in her chest like a second pulse. In the center of the chamber, Daniel hung from a slab, not the weathered stone from the forest, but a new one, polished black and veined with crimson. Chains of rusted iron bound his wrists and ankles, biting into his gray, blood-streaked skin. His head lolled forward, his dark hair matted with sweat and grime, his chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. He was alive, barely, but he wasn't whole. His left arm ended in a jagged stump below the elbow, the wound raw and weeping, and his eyes, when they flickered open, were clouded, unfocused, darting with terror. "Daniel!" Abigail's voice cracked, barely audible over the hum. She took a step forward, her legs trembling, her body a map of pain, her shoulder, her calf, her ribs. The chamber seemed to tilt, the walls breathing with the writhing symbols, their glow intensifying as she moved. The whispers surged, a tidal wave of sound. "Abby, you found me. Help me," his voice raw and pleading, pulling her closer. He lifted his head, slowly, painfully, and his gaze locked onto hers. "Abby," he rasped, his lips cracked and bleeding. You came." His voice was his, but it carried an echo, a shadow of something deeper, something wrong. Abigail's stomach twisted, doubt gnawing at her relief. She'd seen too much, the hollow figures, the mimics, the things that wore familiar shapes. Was this really him? She limped toward the slab, her hands empty, the knife lost to the river. The chains rattled as Daniel shifted, his stump twitching as if reaching for her. Up close, she saw the toll of whatever had happened. His skin was sallow, stretched tight over his bones, his veins dark and bulging beneath it. Bruises mottled his chest, and a deep gash ran across his ribs, oozing a thick, black fluid that wasn't blood. "What happened to you?" she whispered, her throat tight. She reached for the chains, her fingers brushing the cold metal, but hesitated. The hum spiked, a sharp jolt that made her flinch, and the symbols on the walls flared, casting jagged shadows across Daniel's face. His eyes widened, darting past her, and his breath hitched. "Behind you," he croaked. Abigail spun, her heart lurching. The archway she'd come through was no longer empty. 3 hollow-faced figures stood there, their pale forms glistening wet from the river, their heads tilted in unison. They didn't move, didn't speak, but their presence filled the chamber, a suffocating weight that pressed against her skull. The whispers shifted, Daniel's voice fading into a chorus of others. "She's here, she's ours, bring her," cold and relentless. "Stay back," she shouted, stepping between them and the slab, her hands raised uselessly. The figures didn't flinch. They took a step forward, their movements synchronized, their claws clicking against the bone floor. Abigail's chest heaved, panic clawing at her. She had no weapon, no way out, only Daniel, chained and broken, behind her. "Abby, the chains." Daniel's voice cut through the whispers, sharp with urgency. "Break them, please." She turned back to him, her eyes darting to the rusted links. They were old, corroded, but thick, too strong to snap with her hands. She scanned the chamber, desperate, and spotted a shard of bone jutting from the floor, a femur cracked and sharp at one end. She lunged for it, prying it free with a grunt, and stumbled back to the slab. The figures advanced, slow and deliberate, their hollow faces gleaming in the fungal glow. Abigail swung the bone shard at the chains binding Daniel's wrists, the impact jarring her arms. The metal groaned but held. She hit again, harder, her shoulder screaming, and a link cracked, splitting apart. Daniel gasped, his arm falling limp, blood dripping from the stump. "Hurry," he wheezed, his eyes fixed on the figures. They were closer now, halfway across the chamber, their claws outstretched. Abigail attacked the other chain, her strikes frantic, the bone shard splintering with each blow. The second link gave, and Daniel's right arm dropped, his hand trembling as he clutched at the slab. The figures stopped, their heads snapping upward, and a new sound erupted, a low, resonant growl that shook the walls. It came from above, from the shadows cloaking the ceiling, and Abigail's blood ran cold. She looked up, her breath catching, as the darkness shifted, revealing a shape, massive, coiled, its body a tangle of sinew and teeth. It wasn't the creature from the forest or the thing in the shaft. This was something else, something older, its presence a weight that crushed the air from her lungs. "Abby, the legs!" Daniel shouted, his voice breaking. She tore her gaze from the ceiling, slamming the bone shard against the chains at his ankles. The figures moved again, faster now, their claws slashing the air. The growl above deepened, and the shadows writhed, tendrils spilling downward like ink. Abigail struck harder, the bone shard shattering as the first ankle chain snapped. She grabbed another shard, her hands slick with sweat and blood, and freed his other leg just as the figures reached her. She yanked Daniel off the slab, his weight dragging her down. He was heavier than he should have been, his body limp and cold, but she hauled him upright, his arms slung over her shoulder. "Move," she screamed, shoving him toward the archway. The figures lunged, their claws grazing her back, tearing through her jacket. She stumbled, pain flaring, but kept going, Daniel's ragged breaths hot against her neck. The ceiling beast roared, a sound that split the chamber, and the tendrils surged, slamming into the floor where they'd stood. Bones shattered, dust billowing, and the figures scattered, their hollow faces turned upward. Abigail didn't stop. She dragged Daniel through the archway, back onto the stairs, the hum pulsing wild and erratic behind them. The steps were slick, treacherous, and Daniel's weight slowed her, his stump leaving a trail of black fluid. "Keep going," she grunted, her legs burning, her vision blurring. The growl followed, the tendrils snapping at the archway, crumbling the stone. The figures regrouped, their jerky steps echoing up the stairs, their whispers a relentless tide. "She can't take him, he's ours." They reached the ledge by the river, the water churning violently, waves crashing against the rock. The hollow figures emerged behind them, their claws glinting, and above, the ceiling beast's tendrils breached the archway, coiling toward them. Abigail's heart sank. There was nowhere to go but the water, dark and endless, its depths a mystery. "Abby," Daniel's voice was weak, his head lolling against her shoulder. Don't let them." His eyes fluttered shut, his body sagging, and she tightened her grip, tears streaming down her face. The figures closed in, the tendrils lashed, and the river roared. Abigail made her choice. She pulled Daniel with her and leaped, the cold swallowing them whole. The current seized them, dragging them under, the whispers fading into the rush of water. She kicked, her arms burning, holding him tight as the darkness closed in. They surfaced downstream, gasping, the cavern's glow faint and distant. The ledge was gone, the figures and the beast lost to the shadows. Abigail clung to Daniel, her strength fading, the river pulling them deeper into the earth. His eyes opened, just for a moment, and he whispered, "I'm sorry." Before she could answer, the current yanked them under again, and the world went black. The river was a living thing, its current a relentless fist that crushed Abigail and Daniel against its will. Water flooded her lungs, cold and bitter, tasting of earth and rot. She clawed at the darkness, her arms locked around Daniel's limp form, her legs kicking against the pole. Her chest burned, her vision speckled with black, but she fought, driven by a primal need to keep him close, to not lose him again. The river didn't care. It dragged them deeper, tumbling them through its depths like debris in a storm. Her head broke the surface, and she gasped, choking on air and water. Daniel sputtered beside her, his breath shallow, his body heavy in her grip. The cavern stretched around them, its walls a blur of glowing fungi and jagged stone, the ceiling lost in shadow. The current slowed, spilling them into a wider pool, its surface rippling with eerie calm. Abigail's boots found purchase on a submerged ledge, and she hauled Daniel toward it, her muscles screaming, her wounds bleeding anew. She dragged him onto the stone, collapsing beside him, her chest heaving. The water lapped at their legs, its chill seeping into her bones, but they were alive for now. Daniel coughed, black fluid dribbling from his lips, his eyes fluttering open. They were clearer now, less clouded, but still wild with fear. "Abby," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. You shouldn't have." "Shut up," she snapped, her voice raw. "I'm not leaving you." She pushed herself up, wincing as pain flared through her shoulder and calf and scanned the cavern. The pool stretched ahead, its far end swallowed by a tunnel of black water. Behind them, the river churned, its roar a distant echo. The ledge they rested on was narrow, slick with moss, leading to a jagged crevice in the wall, a possible way out if she could get them there. Daniel's hand gripped hers, weak but desperate. "It's not safe," he wheezed, his stump twitching. "They're coming, they won't stop." His words sent a shiver down her spine, and she followed his gaze to the water. It was still, too still, the ripples fading into a mirror-like sheen. The hum pulsed faintly, a heartbeat in the stone, and the whispers crept back. "He's ours, you can't take him," soft and insidious, rising from the pool. Abigail's stomach twisted. She pulled Daniel closer, her eyes darting to the crevice. "We're getting out of here," she said, more to herself than to him. "Come on." She hooked his arm over her shoulder, ignoring the agony in her own body, and half-dragged him toward the wall. His weight slowed her, his breaths ragged, but she didn't let go. The crevice loomed closer, a narrow gash in the rock, its edges sharp and uninviting. The water rippled behind them, a single wave breaking the silence. Abigail froze, her heart lurching, and turned. A figure emerged from the pool, pale, featureless, its hollow face glistening wet. It rose slowly, the water parting around it, its head tilted in that unnerving way. Another followed, then another, their claws clicking against the stone as they stepped onto the ledge. The whispers swelled. "Give him back, he belongs here." Daniel's voice woven into the chorus, accusing, pleading. "No," Abigail growled, shoving Daniel toward the crevice. "He's mine." She pushed him through, his body scraping against the rock, and followed, her shoulders slamming into the stone. Pain blinded her for a moment, but she forced herself forward, the crevice tightening around them. The figures advanced, their steps silent, their hollow faces fixed on her. The passage twisted, narrowing further, the walls slick with moisture and blood, hers, Daniel's, she couldn't tell. The hum pulsed stronger, the symbols carved into the rock glowing faintly, their light casting eerie shadows. Daniel's breathing grew shallower, his body sagging against her. "Keep moving," she urged, her voice trembling. "We're almost there." A claw scraped the stone behind her, too close. She glanced back, and the figures were there, their long fingers reaching into the crevice, their hollow faces pressed against the opening. They didn't speak, didn't growl, just watched, their presence a suffocating weight. Abigail pushed harder, her legs burning, the passage widening into a small chamber. It was a dead end, a circular room, its floor littered with bones, its walls alive with glowing symbols. A single stone pillar stood in the center, its surface etched with spirals and stained with dark, crusted blood. Abigail's heart sank. despair clawing at her chest. "No, no, no, no," she muttered, lowering Daniel to the ground. He slumped against the pillar, his eyes half open, his chest barely moving. The figures entered, slow and deliberate, their claws clicking against the bones. 3 of them, then 4, their hollow faces turned toward her in unison. The whispers erupted. "He stays, you stay," a cacophony that tore at her mind. Abigail stood, placing herself between them and Daniel, her hands empty but clenched into fists. "You're not taking him," she spat, her voice shaking with rage and fear. The hum spiked, the cymbals flaring, and the pillar trembled. A crack split its surface, jagged and deep, and a wave of cold air blasted outward, knocking Abigail back. She hit the wall, her head spinning, and saw it, shadows spilling from the crack, coiling into the air like smoke. They twisted into shapes, faces, hands, torsos, screaming silently before dissolving back into the dark. Daniel gasped, his body jerking upright, his eyes wide and unseeing. "Abby, it's waking," he choked, black fluid dripping from his mouth. The figures froze, their heads snapping toward the pillar, and the shadows surged higher, filling the chamber. A growl rumbled from the crack, low and ancient, shaking the bones underfoot. Abigail crawled to Daniel, pulling him close, her arms trembling. "What's waking?" she demanded, her voice breaking. He didn't answer, his eyes rolled back, his body convulsing, and the shadows wrapped around him, tugging him from her grasp. She screamed, clawing at them, but they were intangible, relentless, dragging him toward the pillar. The figures moved then, lunging at her, their claws slashing the air. She ducked, rolling to the side, and grabbed a bone shard from the floor, sharp, jagged, a makeshift weapon. She swung it, catching one at chest, dark fluid spraying as it staggered back. Another grabbed her arm, its grip iron-tight, and she drove the shard into its hollow face. It released her with a hiss, collapsing, but the others closed in, their claws raking her legs. The pillar cracked wider, the growl becoming a roar, and the shadows solidified, a massive hand, clawed and sinewy, emerging from the stone. It seized Daniel, its fingers wrapping around his torso, and pulled him into the crack. "No!" Abigail shrieked, lunging forward, but the figures blocked her, their hollow faces gleaming with malice. The hand retreated, the crack snapping shut, and Daniel was gone. The shadows dissipated, the hum fading to a low thrum, and the figures stepped back, their heads tilting as if satisfied. Abigail fell to her knees, the bone shard slipping from her hand, her screams echoing in the empty chamber. But the silence didn't last. A whisper rose from the pillar, soft and clear, Daniel's voice, unbroken by the chaos. "Abby, I'm still here." The cymbals flared again, and the floor trembled, fissures splitting the bone mosaic. The figures turned, their hollow faces fixed on her, and the growl returned, deeper, closer, vibrating through the stone. Something was still waking, and it wasn't done with her. Abigail knelt on the fractured bone floor, her hands trembling, her breath ragged and sharp. The chamber pulsed around her, the walls alive with glowing symbols that flickered like dying stars. The air was heavy, thick with the stench of blood and rot, the hum a relentless drumbeat in her skull. Daniel was gone, swallowed by the pillar, taken by the shadowed hand, and yet his voice lingered, a whisper threading through the chaos. "Abby, I'm still here." It was faint, fragile, but it cut through her despair like a blade. The hollow-faced figures stood motionless, their pale forms gleaming in the dim light, their heads tilted in unison. They didn't advance, didn't attack, just watched, their featureless faces a silent accusation. The growl from the pillars swelled, a deep guttural roar that shook the bones beneath her, sending dust and fragments raining down. The fissures in the floor widened, dark tendrils of shadow seeping upward, coiling like smoke. Whatever had taken Daniel wasn't finished. It was waking, stirring, and she was still here, trapped in its lair. She pushed herself to her feet, her legs shaking, her body a map of pain, her shoulder torn, her calf bleeding, her ribs bruised and aching. The bone shard lay at her feet, its edge stained with the dark fluid of the figures she'd fought. She snatched it up, gripping it tight, her knuckles white against the crimson smears. "You're not taking me too," she hissed, her voice raw, her eyes darting between the figures and the pillar. The growl spiked, and the pillar split further, a jagged maw cracking its surface. Shadows poured out, thicker now, solidifying into shapes, clawed hands, eyeless faces, torsos writhing with agony. They didn't dissipate this time. They lingered, circling the chamber, their forms shifting and merging. The figures stepped back, their hollow heads turned upward, as if in reverence, and the hum became a scream, a sound that tore at Abigail's mind. She stumbled toward the pillar, driven by a desperate, irrational need to reach Daniel, to pull him back. The shadows lashed at her, their edges sharp and cold, slicing her arms as she swung the bone shard. "Give him back," she shouted, her voice breaking against the roar. The pillar trembled, the crack widening, and she saw it. Movement within, a flicker of pale skin, a hand reaching out. "Daniel!" she cried, lunging forward. The shadows surged, wrapping around her legs, dragging her down. She hit the floor hard, the bone shard clattering away, and clawed at the stone, her nails breaking against it. The hand emerged further, Daniel's, scarred and trembling, his fingers stretching toward her. She grabbed it, her grip slick with blood, and pulled, her muscles burning. The figures moved then, their claws clicking as they closed in. One seized her arm, its grip crushing, and another slashed at her back, tearing through her jacket. Pain flared, hot and blinding, but she didn't let go. "I've got you," she gasped, hauling Daniel's arm from the crack. His face appeared, gray, hollowed, his eyes wide with terror. But was him real and alive? The shadows tightened, pulling against her, and the growl erupted into a deafening bellow. The pillar shattered, exploding outward in a blast of stone and shadow, and Abigail was thrown back, Daniel's hand slipping from hers. She hit the wall, her head cracking against the rock, her vision swimming. The chamber shook, bones raining down, the symbols flaring into blinding light. When her sight cleared, Daniel lay sprawled on the floor, his chest heaving, his stump bleeding black. The shadows coalesced above him, forming a shape, massive, towering, a nightmare of claws and teeth and hollow eyes. It wasn't the creature from the forest or the shaft. This was something else, something ancient, its body a writhing mass of darkness and flesh. The hollow's heart, she realized, her stomach lurching. The thing that had called him here, that had taken Daniel, that had hunted her. The figures knelt, their hollow faces bowed, and the heart roared, its voice a chorus of screams, Daniel's, hers, countless others. It lunged, its claws slashing toward her, and she rolled, scrambling for the bone shard. Her fingers closed around it just as the claws struck, gouging the stone where she'd been. She swung, the shard sinking into its hide, drawing a spray of dark, hissing fluid. Daniel coughed, his voice weak but urgent. "Abby, the symbols." She glanced at him, then at the walls, the glowing spirals, pulsing with the heart's rhythm. She didn't understand, but she trusted him. She staggered to her feet, dodging another swipe, and drove the shard into the nearest symbol. It flared, a burst of light searing her eyes, and the heart shrieked, its body shuddering. The figures lunged, their claws raking her legs, but she pressed on, slashing at the symbols one by one. Each strike weakened the heart, its form unraveling, shadows spilling like blood. Daniel crawled toward her, his stump dragging, his face twisted with pain. "Keep going," he rasped, his hand reaching for her. The heart roared, its claws slamming into the floor, sending bones flying. Abigail ducked, the shard trembling in her grip, and struck another symbol. The light exploded, blinding, and the heart staggered, its hollow eyes fixed on her. The figures collapsed, their bodies dissolving into ash, and the hum faltered, the chamber trembling as if about to collapse. "Abby now," Daniel shouted, pointing to the pillar's remains, a core of glowing stone, pulsing faintly within the wreckage. She understood. She ran, the heart's claws slashing inches from her back, and plunged the shard into the core. Light erupted, a wave of heat and sound that knocked her flat, the heart's scream echoing into silence. When she opened her eyes, the chamber was still. The heart was gone, the shadows dissipated, the symbols dark and lifeless. The figures were ash, scattered across the bone floor. Daniel lay beside her, his breathing shallow, his eyes half open. "You did it," he whispered, faint smile tugging at his lips. Abigail pulled him close, tears streaming down her face. "We're getting out," she said, her voice firm despite the exhaustion. She helped him up, his weight heavy against her, and limped toward the crevice. The river's roar echoed faintly, a promise of escape, but the silence behind them was heavier, expectant. They reached the ledge, the water churning below, and Abigail paused, her heart pounding. Something shifted in the chamber, a whisper soft and distant. "Abby?" Not Daniel's voice this time, something deeper, older, unbroken by their fight. The hum flickered, a single pulse, and the cavern trembled. She didn't look back. She pulled Daniel into the water, the cold swallowing them, and let the current carry them away. The whispers faded, the darkness closed in, and for the first time, she dared to hope they'd won. But in the chamber, the core pulsed once more, a faint, persistent glow, and the bones began to stir. The river seized Abigail and Daniel with icy hands, pulling them into its depths with a force that stole her breath. The water was black, endless, its cold sinking into her bones, numbing the pain of her wounds but not the fear clawing at her chest. She clung to Daniel, her arms locked around his chest, his head resting against her shoulder. His body was limp, his breath shallow and uneven, but he was alive. She could feel the faint rise and fall of his ribs, the weak pulse in his neck. It was enough to keep her fighting. The current tumbled them through the tunnel, the glowing fungi on the walls blurring into streaks of sickly green. Rocks jutted from the riverbed, their edges sharp and unforgiving, grazing her legs as she kicked to keep them afloat. Her strength was fading, her muscles trembling with exhaustion, but she didn't let go. The whispers were gone, the hum silenced, the heart's roar a memory, but the cavern's final pulse lingered in her mind, a warning she couldn't shake. "Hold on," she gasped, her voice lost to the water's roar. Daniel didn't respond, his eyes closed, his face pale and slack. She tightened her grip, her nails digging into his skin, and scanned the tunnel ahead. The glow brightened, the walls widening, and the current slowed, spilling them into a vast, open chamber. The ceiling arched high above, studded with stalactites that dripped into the pool below, their echoes a soft, rhythmic plink. Abigail's boots scraped against a shallow ledge, and she hauled Daniel onto it, her arms burning with the effort. The water lapped at their feet, gentler now, its surface reflecting the fungal light in shimmering patterns. She collapsed beside him, her chest heaving, her soaked clothes clinging to her like a second skin. The air was warmer here, damp and heavy, carrying a faint scent of moss and stone, a stark contrast to the rot that had haunted them. "Daniel!" She shook him, her hands trembling, her voice hoarse. His eyes fluttered open, clouded but aware, and he coughed, black fluid dribbling from his lips. "Abby?" he rasped, his voice barely audible. We made it." His stump twitched, the wound still weeping, but the black had lessened, replaced by a trickle of red, real blood, human blood. "Yeah," she said, forcing a smile through her tears. "We're out. We're safe." The words felt fragile, uncertain, but she needed them to be true. She scanned the chamber, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The pool stretched across the space, its far end lost in shadow, but along the walls, a narrow path of stone wound upward, disappearing into a crevice high above. An exit, maybe freedom, if they could reach it. She helped Daniel sit up, his weight heavy against her, and checked his wounds. The gash on his ribs was deep, the skin around it gray and puckered, but he was breathing, he was talking. "Can you move?" she asked, her hands steadying him. He nodded, weak but determined, and gripped her arm. "I'll try for you." They stood together, leaning on each other, their steps slow and unsteady. The path was slick, treacherous, littered with loose stones that shifted underfoot. Abigail's leg throbbed, her shoulder ached, but she pushed forward, Daniel's arm slung over her shoulders. The crevice loomed closer, a jagged tear in the rock, its edges softened by moss. Beyond it, she heard a faint sound, wind, distant and mournful, a promise of the surface. The water rippled behind them, a soft splash breaking the silence. Abigail froze, her heart lurching, and turned. The pool was still, its surface smooth, but the shadows beneath it shifted, subtle, deliberate, like something swimming just out of sight. "Keep going," she whispered, urging Daniel forward, her eyes fixed on the water. The hum flickered, a single pulse, faint but unmistakable, and her stomach twisted. They reached the crevice, its narrow mouth barely wide enough for them to squeeze through. Abigail went first, pulling Daniel after her, his grunts of pain echoing in the tight space. The stones scraped her wounds, fresh blood mixing with the old, but she didn't stop. The wind grew louder, cooler, carrying the scent of rain and earth. The storm, still raging above, a lifeline to the world they'd left behind. The crevice opened into a tunnel, its floor sloping upward, the walls rough but dry. Abigail's chest tightened with hope, her pace quickening despite the pain. "We're close," she said, her voice trembling with relief. Daniel nodded, his breaths labored, his hand clutching her arm. The tunnel twisted, the fungal glow fading, replaced by a sliver of gray light ahead, daylight, or what passed for it in the storm. The hum pulsed again, stronger, and the ground trembled. Abigail stumbled, catching herself against the wall, her eyes darting back. The tunnel was empty, the crevice a dark maw behind them, but the water's splash echoed faintly, growing louder, closer. "Move," she shouted, dragging Daniel toward the light. The wind howled, the gray brightening, and she saw it, a jagged opening, rain pouring through, the forest beyond a blur of green and shadow. They burst out onto a muddy slope, the storm slamming into them with relentless fury. Rain lashed their faces, the wind tearing at their clothes, but Abigail laughed, a broken, desperate sound. They were out. The cabin, the diner, the cavern, all behind them, swallowed by the earth. She pulled Daniel down the slope, their boots slipping in the muck, until they reached a clearing, a road, the same one she'd driven in on, its gravel glinting wet in a dim light. The truck was gone, lost to the forest or the river, but she didn't care. She sank to her knees, Daniel beside her, his head resting on her shoulder. "We did it," she whispered, tears mixing with the rain. He nodded, his hands squeezing hers, his breath warm against her neck. But the hum didn't stop. It followed them, a low thrum in the ground, vibrating through the gravel. Abigail's smile faded, her eyes scanning the trees. The storm roared, the wind bending the branches, but something else moved, a shadow tall and thin, darting between the trunks. Then another and another, their hollow faces gleaming pale in the rain. "No," she breathed, her heart sinking. She pulled Daniel up, her legs trembling, and backed away, her eyes locked on the figures. They didn't rush, didn't lunge, just watched, their heads tilted, their claws clicking against the bark. The hum grew louder, the ground shaking, and a crack split the road ahead, dark tendrils spilling upward. The heart wasn't dead. It had followed them, its reach stretching beyond a cavern, its hunger unquenched. Abigail's chest tightened, despair clawing at her hope. She'd fought, she'd won, she'd saved him. But it wasn't enough. The figures stepped onto the road, their hollow faces turned toward her, and the tendrils surged, coiling toward them. Daniel's hand tightened on hers, his voice weak but firm. "Run, Abby. Don't stop." She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "Not without you." She pulled him with her, stumbling down the road, the storm raging around them, the figures closing in. The tendrils lashed, snapping at their heels, and the hum became a roar, a promise of something vast and unstoppable. The road stretched ahead, endless and unforgiving, the forest a cage of shadow and rain. Abigail ran, Daniel's weight dragging her down, her body screaming, her mind fraying. The figures followed, silent and relentless, the heart's presence a weight in her soul. She didn't know where they were going, only that they couldn't stop. Not now, not ever. Behind them, the crack widened, and a claw emerged, massive, sinewy, its nails glinting in the storm. The hollow's heart rose, its hollow eyes fixed on them, and the world trembled. The storm swallowed the world, a gray abyss of rain and wind that blurred the edges of Abigail's vision. She ran, her boots pounding the gravel, Daniel's arms slung over her shoulders, his weight a constant pull against her fading strength. The road stretched ahead, a winding scar through the forest, its end lost in the deluge. Behind them, the hollow's heart rose from the crack, its massive form a nightmare of shadow and sinew, its claws tearing at the earth. The hum was a roar now, a sound that shook the trees, the sky, her bones. Daniel stumbled, his legs buckling, and Abigail tightened her grip, dragging him upright. "Keep going," she shouted, her voice raw, nearly lost to the wind. His breaths were shallow, his face pale and slick with rain, but his eyes flickered with a desperate resolve. "I'm trying," he gasped, his stump bleeding anew, red mingling with black against his torn shirt. The figures flanked them, their hollow faces gleaming wet, their movements jerky but relentless. They didn't attack, just paced her, their claws clicking against the gravel, their heads tilted as if savoring her struggle. The tendrils lashed from the crack, dark and serpentine, snapping at the air inches from her heels. Abigail's heart pounded, her lungs burning, her wounds screaming with every step. She couldn't outrun them, not like this, not with Daniel, but she couldn't stop either. The heart's roar split the storm, a sound that wasn't just heard but felt, a wave of pressure that knocked her forward. She hit the ground hard, gravel biting her knees, Daniel tumbling beside her. The tendrils surged, coiling around her legs, their touch cold and slick, pulling her back. She clawed at the road, her nails breaking, her screams drowned by the wind. "No, let go." Daniel grabbed her arm, his grip weak but fierce, and yanked her free, the tendrils snapping back with a hiss. "Get up," he rasped, pulling her to her feet. The heart loomed closer, its hollow eyes blazing with a light that wasn't light. Darkness given form, a void that sucked at her soul. Its claws raked the ground, tearing furrows in the gravel, and the figures closed in, their hollow faces turned toward her in unison. Abigail staggered forward, dragging Daniel with her, her eyes darting for anything, a weapon, a shelter, a miracle. The road curved, dipping into a shallow ravine, and she saw it, a rusted bridge spanning a swollen creek, its iron frame trembling in the storm. It wasn't much, but it was something, a choke point, chance. "There," she shouted, pointing, and pushed harder, her legs shaking, her vision blurring with rain and tears. The bridge groaned as they reached it, its planks slick and rotting, the creek below a churning torrent of mud and debris. Abigail shoved Daniel ahead, her hands trembling, and turned to face the heart. It towered over the road, its body a writhing mass of shadow and flesh, its claws glinting like obsidian. The figures flanked it, their hollow faces gleaming, and the tendrils lashed forward, slamming into the bridge's edge. The structure buckled, wood splintering, and Abigail stumbled, catching herself on the railing. "Move!" she screamed, pushing Daniel toward the other side. He limped, his breaths ragged, his hand clutching her arm. The heart roared again, its claws slashing the air, and the bridge shook, metal screeching as it bent under the assault. The tendrils coiled around supports, tearing them free, and the planks tilted, threatening to collapse. They reached the far side just as the bridge gave way, crashing into the creek with a deafening crack. Abigail fell, pulling Daniel down with her, the muddy bank sucking at their bodies. The heart stopped at the edge, its hollow eyes fixed on them, the tendrils writhing in the water below. The figures stood beside it, silent and still, their hollow faces turned upward as if listening. For a moment, the storm was the only sound, the rain, the wind, the creek's roar. Abigail's chest heaved, her hands clutching Daniel, her eyes locked on the heart. It didn't cross, it couldn't, or wouldn't, the broken bridge a barrier it refused to breach. The tendrils retreated, sinking into the water, and the hum faded, a low thrum swallowed by the storm. "We're okay," she whispered, her voice trembling, her tears mixing with the rain. Daniel nodded, his head resting against her shoulder, his breath slowing. "For now," he murmured, his voice faint but steady. She helped him up, her body screaming, and they limped down the road, the forest thinning around them. The heart watched, its hollow eyes unblinking, the figures motionless at its side. Abigail didn't look back, she couldn't. She focused on the road, on Daniel, on the faint hope of safety ahead. The storm raged, the wind howling through the trees, but the hum was gone, the whispers silent. The road climbed, the gravel giving way to cracked pavement, and a sign loomed out of the rain, Wicker Hollow 1 mile. Abigail's stomach twisted, but she pushed it down. The town meant people, help, a chance to rest. She tightened her grip on Daniel, her steps steady despite the pain, and they pressed on, the storm a relentless companion. The first buildings emerged, dilapidated houses, their windows dark, their roofs sagging under the rain. The streets were empty, the town silent save for the storm's fury. Abigail's hope faltered, a chill creeping up her spine. "Where is everyone?" she muttered, her eyes scanning the shadows. Daniel stiffened beside her, his hand tightening on her arm. "Abby," he whispered, his voice trembling. She followed his gaze, and her blood ran cold. A figure stood in the distance, pale and featureless, its hollow face turned toward them. Another appeared, then another, stepping from doorways, alleys, their claws clicking against the pavement. The hum returned, faint but growing, a pulse in the ground beneath her feet. The figures didn't move closer, just watched, their heads tilted, their presence a weight that crushed her fragile relief. Abigail backed away, pulling Daniel with her, her heart pounding. "No, and not again." A roar erupted behind them, distant but unmistakable. The heart, its voice shaking the town. The ground trembled, cracks splitting the pavement, and shadows seeped upward, coiling into the air. The figures stepped forward, slow and deliberate, their hollow faces gleaming in the rain. Abigail turned, dragging Daniel down a side street, her mind racing. The town wasn't safe, it wasn't a haven. It was theirs, a trap woven into the storm, the forest, the earth itself. The hum pulsed stronger, the shadows surging, and the figures followed, their claws scraping the stone. They reached a church, its steeple bent and broken, its doors hanging ajar. Abigail shoved them open, pulling Daniel inside, and slammed them shut, the wood groaning under her weight. The interior was dark, damp, the pews overturned, the air thick with mildew, and something sharper, blood. She dragged a bench across the doors, her hands shaking, and turned to Daniel. He slumped against the wall, his face ashen, his eyes wide with fear. "It's not over," he whispered, his voice breaking. "It never will be." The hum pulsed through the church, the windows rattling, and shadows crept under the doors, tendrils of darkness probing the cracks. Abigail grabbed his hand, her voice firm despite the terror. "We're not done yet." She pulled him toward the altar, her eyes searching for anything, a weapon, an exit, a way to fight. The shadows surged, the figure's claws scraping the doors, and the heart's roar shook the walls. The floor cracked beneath them, a jagged line splitting the stone, and the hum became a scream. Abigail's hope shattered, but her resolve didn't. She'd come this far, she wouldn't let it end here. The church trembled as the heart's roar reverberated through its walls, a sound that splintered the stained glass windows into jagged shards. Abigail stood at the altar, her hand gripping Daniel's, her breath fogging in the cold, damp air. The shadows surged under the doors, tendrils of darkness coiling across the cracked stone floor, their edges sharp and alive. The hum pulsed like a living thing, a heartbeat that shook the pews, the walls, her skull. Outside, the figures scratched at the wood, their claws carving slow, deliberate grooves, a promise of what was coming. Daniel slumped beside her, his body trembling, his stump bleeding a mix of red and black onto the altar's edge. His eyes were glassy, darting with fear, but he squeezed her hand, his voice a faint rasp. "Abby, we can't keep running." The words cut her, a knife of despair, but she shook her head, her jaw clenched. "We're not giving up," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. She scanned the church, her eyes desperate for anything to fight with, to hold the line. The altar was bare, its cloth rotted and torn, but beneath it, a glint caught her eye, a rusted candlestick, heavy and solid, its base crusted with wax. She snatched it up, hefting it in her hand, its weight a small comfort against the nightmare closing in. The doors buckled with splintering, and the shadows poured through, a flood of writhing darkness that swallowed the light. The figures followed, their hollow faces gleaming pale, their claws clicking against the stone as they stepped inside. 5 of them. No, 6. Their heads tilted in unison, their movements jerky but purposeful. The tendrils lashed forward, snapping at the air, and Abigail swung the candlestick, its base smashing into one. It hissed, a sound like steam escaping, and recoiled, dark fluid dripping from its hollow face. "Stay behind me," she shouted, shoving Daniel back. He stumbled, catching himself on the altar, his breath shallow and ragged. The figures advanced, their claws outstretched, and the heart's roar shook the church again, dust raining from the rafters. The floor cracked wider, a jagged fissure splitting the nave, and shadows erupted from it, coiling toward her. She swung again, the candlestick striking another figure, its hollow face crumpling under the blow. It collapsed, dissolving into ash, but the others pressed closer, their claws slashing her arms, her legs. Pain flared, hot and blinding, but she didn't falter, she couldn't. The tendrils wrapped around her ankle, cold and slick, yanking her down. She hit the floor, the candlestick slipping from her grip and clawed at the stone, her nails breaking as she fought free. Daniel lunged, weak but desperate, grabbing the candlestick and swinging it at the nearest figure. It connected with a dull thud, the hollow face cracking, and the figure staggered back, ash spilling from its wounds. "Abby, get up," he gasped, his voice breaking, his arm trembling with the effort. She scrambled to her feet, her hands slick with blood, and took the candlestick from him, her resolve hardening. The heart's presence grew heavier, a weight that crushed the air from her lungs. The shadows solidified, forming claws, teeth, eyes, hollow, endless eyes that stare from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. The figures circled, their hollow faces turned toward her, and the tendrils surged, slamming into the altar. It shattered stone and went exploding outward, and Daniel fell, his cry lost to the roar. Abigail dove for him, pulling him from the wreckage, her arms trembling. "Hold on," she shouted, dragging him toward the back of the church. The shadows followed, their claws raking the stone, the figures closing in. She spotted a door behind the altar, small, warped, its hinges rusted but intact. An exit, maybe a chance. She yanked it open, the wood groaning, and shoved Daniel through, following as the tendrils snapped at her heels. They stumbled into a narrow stairwell, its steps spiraling upward, the air thick with mildew and decay. The door slammed shut behind them, the shadows pounding against it, the figure's claws scraping the wood. Abigail pushed Daniel ahead, her hands on his back, her legs burning with every step. "Go," she urged, her voice hoarse, the candlestick still clutched in her hand. The stairwell twisted, the walls closing in, the hum pulsing through the stone. The door below buckled, splintering, and the shadows poured through, a tide of darkness that climbed the stairs. The figures followed, their hollow faces gleaming in the dim light, their claws clicking against the steps. Abigail swung the candlestick, smashing it into the nearest one, ash exploding as it fell, but the others pressed closer, relentless. They reached the top, a bell tower, its roof half collapsed, rain pouring through the gaps. The bell hung silent, its rope rotted away, the storm's wind howling through the broken walls. Abigail pulled Daniel to the center, her chest heaving, her eyes darting for a way out. The tower was a dead end. No ladder, no windows low enough to reach, just the gaping hole above and the storm beyond. The shadows surged up the stairs, the figures emerging behind them, their hollow faces turned upward. The heart's roar shook the tower, the walls trembling, and the floor cracked, tendrils spilling through. Abigail backed against the bell, Daniel beside her, his hand gripping hers. "Abby," he whispered, his voice faint, his eyes pleading. "I'm sorry. I brought you here." "No," she said, her voice fierce. "I came for you. I'd do it again." She raised the candlestick, her hands shaking, her body a wreck of pain and defiance. The figures closed in, their claws outstretched, the shadows coiling around her legs, her arms. The heart's presence filled the tower, a suffocating weight, its hollow eyes blazing from the darkness below. The bell tolled, a single deafening clang that shook the air, the stone her bones. Abigail flinched, her ears ringing, and the figures staggered, their hollow faces cracking. The shadows recoiled, hissing, and the hum faltered, a stutter in its relentless pulse. She swung the candlestick, striking the bell again, the sound exploding outward. The figures shrieked, ash spilling from their forms, and the tendrils retreated, shrinking back into the cracks. "Keep hitting it," Daniel shouted, his voice breaking through the chaos. Abigail struck again, and again, each told a hammer against the heart's roar. The figures collapsed, dissolving into ash, the shadows writhing as if in pain. The tower shook, stones falling from the walls, and the hum weakened, fading to a low thrum. The heart's roar surged one last time, a desperate, furious sound, and the shadows lashed out, slamming into the bell. It cracked, the toll cutting off mid-ring, and Abigail stumbled, the candlestick falling from her grip. The tendrils seized her, dragging her toward the edge, the storm's rain stinging her face. Daniel grabbed her arm, pulling against them, his strength fading. "Hold on," he cried, his voice raw, his stump bleeding onto the stone. The shadows tightened, their claws sinking into her flesh, and the heart's eyes blazed, closer now, rising from the stairwell. Abigail's vision blurred, her body failing, but she clung to Daniel, her fingers digging into his hand. The tower groaned, the walls buckling, and the floor gave way, plunging them into darkness. They fell, the shadows screaming around them, the heart's roar swallowing the storm. Abigail held Daniel tight, her heart pounding, her mind fraying, and the world dissolved into cold, endless black. The darkness consumed them as they fell, a void of cold and silence that stripped away the storm, the church, the heart's roar. Abigail clung to Daniel, her arms locked around him, his weight a tether in the abyss. The air rushed past, icy and relentless, pulling at her wounds, her breath, her sanity. She couldn't see, couldn't hear, only feel the rapid thud of her heart and the faint, erratic pulse of his against her chest. Time stretched, seconds or hours, until the fall ended with a jolt that shattered her senses. They hit water, deep, frigid, its impact a hammer against her ribs. The cold swallowed her scream, bubbles streaming from her mouth as she sank, Daniel slipping from her grasp. She kicked, her legs heavy, her lungs burning, and clawed toward the surface, her hands searching for him. Her fingers brushed his arm, then his hair, and she pulled, dragging him up with her. They broke through, gasping, the water churning around them in a cavern vast and echoing. The ceiling loomed high above, studded with glowing fungi that cast a faint, sickly light over the pool. Stalactites hung like teeth, dripping into the water with soft, rhythmic plinks. Abigail treaded water, her arms trembling, Daniel's head resting against her shoulder. His breaths were shallow, his eyes half open, clouded with pain and exhaustion. "Abby," he rasped, his voice barely audible over the lapping waves. "Where?" "I don't know," she said, her teeth chattering, her gaze sweeping the cavern. The pool stretched wide, its edges lost in shadow, but a rocky shore glimmered faintly to her left, jagged and uneven. She swam toward it, pulling Daniel with her, her muscles screaming, her wounds bleeding anew. The water was thick, its surface oily, carrying that familiar metallic tang that clung to her throat. They reached the shore, and Abigail hauled Daniel onto the stone, collapsing beside him. Her chest heaved, her soaked clothes clinging to her skin, the cold sinking into her core. The cavern was silent save for their ragged breathing and the drip of water, a stark contrast to the chaos above. The hum was gone, the whispers absent, the heart's presence a distant memory, or so she hoped. Daniel coughed, black fluid dribbling from his lips, his stump twitching against the rock. We fell," he murmured, his eyes fluttering shut. Abigail shook him, her hands trembling. "Stay with me," she said, her voice firm despite the fear clawing at her. She checked his wounds, his ribs, his stump, the bruises mottling his chest. He was alive, but barely, his skin gray and clammy. She scanned the shore, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The cavern stretched into shadow, its walls carved with faint, spiraling symbols. Dormant now, their glow extinguished. The tunnel loomed ahead, its mouth dark and uninviting, but it was the only way out. She didn't trust it, didn't trust anything in this place, but they couldn't stay here, exposed and vulnerable. A faint sound broke the silence, a crack sharp and distant, like stone splitting. Abigail froze, her heart lurching, her eyes darting to the tunnel. The water rippled, subtle but deliberate, and the hum flickered, a single pulse that vibrated through the rock. "No," she whispered, her stomach twisting. She pulled Daniel closer, her hands shaking, and the crack came again, louder, closer. The tunnel's mouth shifted, shadows spilling from it. Not tendrils, not figures, but something else, something solid. A claw emerged, massive, sinewy, its nails glinting in the fungal glow, followed by another, gripping the stone. The heart climbed out, its body a writhing mass of darkness and flesh, its hollow eyes blazing with that void-like light. It was smaller here, weakened, its form fraying at the edges, but it was alive, its hunger undimmed. Abigail staggered to her feet, pulling Daniel with her, her legs trembling. "Get up!" she shouted, her voice echoing off the walls. He groaned, his eyes fluttering open, and gripped her arm, his strength fading. The heart roared, a sound that shook the cavern, dust raining from the ceiling, and lunged, its claws slashing the air. She dove, dragging Daniel behind a stalagmite, the claws gouging the stone where they'd stood. The heart's eyes fixed on her, its maw splitting open, revealing jagged teeth that gleamed wet and sharp. It moved slower now, its body shuddering, shadows peeling away like skin, but it didn't stop. It was relentless, driven by something deeper than rage, a need, a purpose she couldn't fathom. "We can't fight it," Daniel rasped, his voice breaking. "Not like this." Abigail's chest tightened, despair clawing at her, but she shook her head. "We're not dying here." She scanned ashore, her eyes landing on a shard of rock, sharp, jagged, a makeshift spear. She snatched it up, her hands slick with water and blood, and faced the heart, her resolve a fragile flame in the dark. It charged, its claws raking the stone, and she swung, the shard sinking into its hide. Dark fluid sprayed, hissing as it hit the ground, and the heart shrieked, its body recoiling. Abigail struck again, driving the shard deeper, her arms burning with the effort. The shadows unraveled, spilling from its wounds, and its hollow eyes dimmed, flickering like a dying flame. Daniel grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "The tunnel," he gasped, pointing. It's open." The heart's assault had widened the tunnel's mouth, revealing a faint glow beyond, red, pulsing like firelight. Abigail didn't hesitate. She dragged Daniel toward it, the heart's claws slashing inches from her back. They stumbled through, the stones scraping their skin, the heart's roar chasing them into the dark. The tunnel twisted, the air growing warmer, the red glow brightening. The heart followed, its claws tearing at the walls, its shadows spilling behind them. Abigail's legs burned, her vision blurring, but she pushed forward, Daniel's weight a constant pull. The tunnel opened into a chamber, a vast, domed space, its floor scorched black, its walls alive with flames that flickered without fuel. In the center stood a pyre, its fire roaring high, its heat a wall that stung her face. The symbols here were different, angular, jagged, glowing with a fierce, unyielding light. The heart burst in behind them, its body fraying, its hollow eyes blazing with fury. It lunged, and Abigail shoved Daniel aside, raising the shard as its claws slashed toward her. The flames flared, a wave of heat and light that slammed into the heart, driving it back. It shrieked, its shadows burning, its form dissolving under the fire's assault. Abigail stumbled, shielding her eyes, the shard trembling in her hand. The pyre pulsed, the symbols flaring, and the heart's roar became a wail, a sound of agony and defeat. It collapsed, its body crumbling into ash, the shadows dissipating into the flames. The hum stopped, the cavern stilling, the fire dimming to a steady glow. Abigail fell to her knees, her chest heaving, the shard slipping from her grip. Daniel crawled to her, his hand finding hers, his voice a whisper. It's over." She nodded, tears streaming down her face, and pulled in close, the heat warming their soaked, battered bodies. The flames crackled, the cymbals pulsed faintly, and for the first time, the silence felt real, empty, unbroken, a fragile peace. But in the shadows beyond the pyre, a single symbol flickered, its light cold and persistent, and the ash stirred ever so slightly. The flames crackled in the chamber, their light casting long, dancing shadows across the scorched stone. Abigail knelt beside Daniel, her arms wrapped around him, his head resting against her chest. The heat of the pyre warmed her soaked skin, drying the blood and rain that clung to her, but couldn't touch the cold knot of dread in her gut. The heart was gone, its ashes scattered across the floor, its hollow eyes extinguished, its roar silenced. Yet the silence felt wrong, too heavy, too fragile, like glass waiting to shatter. Daniel's breaths were shallow, his body trembling against hers, his stump pressed to his side. The black fluid had stopped, replaced by a slow trickle of red, but his skin was still gray, his eyes sunken and distant. "Abby," he whispered, his voice a threadbare whisper. We did it." He tried to smile, his lips cracking, and she forced one back, her tears hot against her cheeks. "Yeah," she said, her voice hoarse, her hand brushing his matted hair. "We did." She wanted to believe it, needed to, but her eyes kept darting to the ashes, to the shadows beyond the pyre. The flames flickered, steady but subdued, the angular symbols on the walls glowing with a faint, unyielding light. The air was thick with the scent of burnt flesh and stone, a bitter tang that stung her nose. She shifted, wincing as pain flared through her shoulder, her leg, her ribs, every part of her a testament to the fight. The shard of rock lay beside her, its edge stained with the heart's dark fluid, a silent witness to their victory. She reached for it, her fingers trembling, and held it close, its weight a small anchor in the chaos. "We need to move," she said, her voice firm despite the exhaustion. "Find a way out." Daniel nodded, weak but willing, and gripped her arm, pulling himself up with her help. They stood together, leaning on each other, their steps slow and unsteady across the ash-strewn floor. The tunnel they'd come through was dark, its mouth sealed by fallen stone, but another passage loomed on the far side of the chamber, a narrow slit in the wall, its edges rough and unlit. The pyre flared suddenly, a burst of heat and light that made Abigail flinch, her hand tightening on the shard. The ashes stirred, a faint ripple across the floor, and her heart lurched. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her eyes fixed on the pile. Daniel followed her gaze, his breath catching, his grip on her arm tightening. "It's nothing," he said, but his voice trembled, uncertain. The flames steadied, the ashes settled, and the silence pressed in again. Abigail didn't move, didn't breathe, waiting for something, sound, a shadow, a whisper. Nothing came, but the single symbol beyond the pyre flickered, its cold light pulsing once, then dimming. "Let's go," she said, pulling Daniel toward the passage. She didn't look back, she couldn't. The tunnel swallowed them, its walls closing in, the air cooler and damp. The fungal glow was gone, replaced by a faint, gray light filtering from ahead, the light, distant but real. Her chest tightened with hope, fragile but fierce, and she quickened her pace, Daniel's weight a steady pull against her. The passage twisted, the stone rough underfoot, the light growing brighter. The sound of dripping water echoed faintly, joined by a soft rush wind, or a river, she couldn't tell. The walls widened, the ceiling rising, and the tunnel opened into a shallow cave, its mouth framed by jagged rock. Beyond it, the storm raged on, rain lashing a muddy slope, the forest a blur of green and shadow. Abigail stumbled out, the cold rain stinging her face, Daniel beside her. The sky was gray, heavy with clouds, but it was the sky, open, vast, alive. She laughed, a broken, desperate sound, and sank to her knees, pulling Daniel down with her. "We're out," she gasped, tears mixing with the rain. "We're really out." He nodded, his hands squeezing hers, his eyes bright with relief. "You saved me," he whispered, his voice cracking. She shook her head, her throat tight. We saved each other. The cave loomed behind them, its darkness a silent weight, but the hum was gone, the whispers absent. Abigail scanned the slope, her eyes tracing the muddy path downward. A road glinted faintly in the distance, gravel, worn but real, stretching into the trees. It wasn't the one she'd driven in on, but it was something, a way back to the world to help to safety. She helped Daniel up, her legs trembling, and they started down the slope, the rain a relentless drum against their battered bodies. The forest was quiet, the wind bending the branches, the shadows still. Too still. Abigail's grip on the shard tightened, her eyes darting between the trees, her heart pounding with every step. A crack split the air, sharp, sudden, like stone breaking. She froze, Daniel stiffening beside her, and turned. The cave's mouth was empty, the darkness unbroken, but the sound came again, deeper, closer. The ground trembled, a faint shudder that rippled through the mud, and the rain seemed to slow, the air thickening with a familiar weight. No, she breathed, her voice trembling. Daniel's hand tightened on hers, his eyes wide with fear. "Abby, run," he whispered, but his legs buckled, his strength spent. She pulled him closer, her gaze fixed on the cave, her mind racing. The shadows shifted, a flicker of movement at the tunnel's edge, and a figure emerged, pale, featureless, its hollow face gleaming wet. Another followed, then another, their claws clicking against the stone, their heads tilted in unison. The hum returned, a low thrum in the earth, and the ashes in the chamber stirred, unseen but felt, a pulse that echoed in her bones. The heart wasn't dead, it couldn't die. It was the hollow, the root of this nightmare, and they were its prey, marked from the moment she'd stepped into the forest. Abigail's chest tightened, despair warring with defiance. She raised the shard, her hand shaking, Daniel's weight heavy against her. The figures stepped onto the slope, slow and deliberate, their hollow faces turned toward her. The ground cracked, tendrils spilling upward, and a roar erupted from the cave, distant but growing, the heart rising once more. Abigail backed away, pulling Daniel with her, her eyes locked on the figures, the shard trembling in her grip. The road was close. She could see it, feel it, but the hollow was closer, its reach endless, its hunger eternal. She turned, dragging Daniel toward the gravel, her legs burning, her heart breaking. The storm raged, the figures followed, and the heart's roars swallowed the dawn. They reached the road, stumbling onto its surface, the rain a curtain around them. Abigail looked back, the figures closing in, the tendrils lashing, the cave a maw of shadow and fury. She didn't know where the road led, only that it was away, away from the hollow, away from the nightmare. She ran, Daniel beside her, the shard clutched tight, the heart's roar of promise in the dark. The forest blurred, the road stretched on, and the dawn remained a distant, unreachable light.